it's really a crisis of confidence, and I just don't see that Hegseth can last much longer without causing real damage certainly within the uniformed ranks at the Pentagon.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've had John Bolton on the show. He's, of course, Donald Trump's former national security advisor. He's also the US ambassador to the UN. He's joined the show to discuss all the big stories coming out of Donald Trump's administration, which is, of course, his comments that he wants to reopen Alcatraz. Can that be done? What would it mean? He's also spoken to us about the fact that Trump has offered to pay illegal migrants, $1,000 to self-deport themselves. So what that means, would it even be enticing for illegal immigrants? We've also spoken to him about Mike Waltz leaving his post as National Security Advisor, whether it was a promotion, the way he says it is. And of course, the meeting between Canada's new Prime Minister Mark Carney and Donald Trump today, which will be in the Oval Office, and whether we're looking at another showdown between these two. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on Times Radio's YouTube. Former National Security Advisor and former US Ambassador to the UN, John Bolton, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Glad to be with you.
So much for you and I to go through in the last week or so when it comes to your expert analysis on what's been happening in the Trump administration. But I want to start off a little bit timely and get your thoughts on Donald Trump's pretty bizarre comments. He says he wants to reopen Alcatraz, and I think no one would have expected a comment like this. His reasoning is that the US has been plagued by vicious, violent and repeated criminal offenders, and that Alcatraz represents something very strong and something very powerful when it comes to law and order. Of course, Alcatraz has been closed since 1963. But what was your reaction to these comments from your former boss, John?
Well, you know, it's as if Trump is living in a movie from the 1950s or something like that, when people were trying to break out of Alcatraz and swim across 1.5 miles of the San Francisco Bay to make it to shore. It's an interesting island. It is in the middle of the San Francisco Bay. Right now it's a big tourist attraction, so it would mean a decline in revenue for the federal government if they did it. I don't know what the logistics are or what the cost would be compared to a high security prison somewhere else. But this is the kind of thing Trump spends his time on. This idea didn't come out of careful study or evaluation. He just woke up one morning and decided he wanted to do it, and that's how government policy is made in his second term.
and from kind of studies from when it was operating, John, as you said, it's around about 3 times the amount of money spent on operating this prison compared to a normal federal prison, and there's massive structural issues that would make sewage and water really hard for inmates to be there and to run it. It would be such a costly operation regardless. But Senator Adam Schiff, when he was responding, he made a video, basically a 5-minute video responding to why this basically cannot happen. But he said that the reason why Trump does want to open Alcatraz is basically just to appear tough. Is that your reaction to it?
Well, it's that, and as I say, he's reliving old memories about what a fearsome prison was. Alcatraz was when it functioned as a prison. But the reason it was shut down so many years ago was that it was falling apart back then. So I don't see how you could rebuild it unless you leveled pretty much everything was there now and started over. And one can only imagine what the cost would be. It's not like there's a road across San Francisco Bay. You'd have to bring everything that was needed for construction by boat. It would take time and money. I mean, maybe the island can be used for something productive, but I don't think a prison really makes sense.
In an effort to crack down on illegal immigration, John, we know that this was a massive campaign promise for the Trump administration. We know that illegal immigration has been a problem, especially under the Biden administration. And you were, of course, working under Donald Trump and knew that it was an issue regardless of who was in power, but more numbers under Joe Biden. But Donald Trump's administration have now announced that they're offering $1,000 and travel assistance to any migrants who will voluntarily self-deport themselves from the United States, because the cost of arresting, detaining and deporting someone who is illegally in the United States is around $17,000 per person, according to the DHS. So It's kind of had a little bit of backlash from human rights advocates who believe that this is cruel and it's a misleading operation. So do you think that Trump is in the right when he says this, or do you think that he could have done this in a different way?
Well, I think it's a bit of a sign of desperation. I think we should separate this illegal immigration question into two parts. Part one, how has Trump done in effectively closing the Mexican border? That is to say, stopping new illegal immigrants from coming into the United States. And I think almost everybody would agree that it's actually been very successful. He has substantially reduced the number of people trying to come across, meaning the number who are apprehended is way down. And it's a function of seeing deterrence work. If people in Central America or South America know they're not going to get in when they reach the U.S. border, they're sensible enough they're not going to leave their towns and villages to begin with. And that was the state of play at the end of Trump's first term. It was Biden who reversed that and started new waves of people packing up and coming across. And not just from this hemisphere, people from China, all over the world were coming across the Mexican border. That problem isn't totally solved, but it's much less of a problem than before Trump took office. Where Trump is having a lot of trouble is in the second part of what he promised, which is mass deportation of illegal immigrants already in the country. And during the campaign, they had talked about this idea of self-deportation. They downplayed the idea that they'd require massive roundups of illegal aliens, and they said many would self-deport on their own. That has not happened. So now they're offering this $1,000 and airfare back to wherever the people came from, I think hoping that it will get their numbers up so that they can say more illegal aliens have left the country. There's a risk if you're an illegal and you're picked up, you could be deported. But is it a risk that you're going to say $1,000 is going to persuade me to give up everything I have in the United States to go back? I personally am very skeptical this will have any impact.
And it is important to note, Ambassador Bolton, that yes, there were those incentives, those protocols that Trump had put into motion, remain in Mexico, and of course Title 42 that were quite successful at deterring migrants away. So you're absolutely right there. So it will be interesting to see if this does work, because as you said, $1,000, weighing up $1,000 over a safer life with more work in the United States, it's kind of not comparable.
No, I don't think it is. I don't think it's nearly enough. If they said $100,000, you'd probably get a lot of people to self-deport, but then you would bankrupt the program. So I think they're having difficulty. Those who are familiar with the circumstances of many illegals in this country predicted this, that they are, after years of living here, woven into the economy. And it's an issue that we haven't dealt with effectively. And I think if Trump's effort to deport the illegals largely fails, that may finally bring Congress to the realization that they've got to get serious and not simply act politically faced with this issue.
Especially as this is one of the big issues he was elected on. Tackling migration and the economy were probably the two big issues that Trump campaigned on, and was successful at campaigning on that. So we've had that poor economic report from last week, Ambassador Bolton, when we saw the economy slump by 0.3%, and then of course tackling immigration. So I want to get your thoughts on this economy. Donald Trump responded in a speech basically blaming Joe Biden. He said that it was a fallout from the Biden administration, a hangover from their term. Regardless, most economists have disagreed with Donald Trump on that. They've said, no, this was in response to the tariffs. You can understand that people have been less willing to spend money. They've been concerned about their stocks and vice versa. But if Donald Trump does lose public support, public trust when it comes to the economy, will that really hurt him politically? Will that be the end of him politically?
Yeah, I think an economy that doesn't show improvement would be disastrous for Trump. And his election in 2024 was relatively close. He won, there's no doubt about it, but it was not a landslide, meaning that several factors could have influenced why he won a narrow plurality of the popular vote, which doesn't count in our system, but did win the Electoral College. I think, though, overwhelmingly people would say that a lot of voters who had turned to Biden in 2020 because they wanted a safe pair of hands rather than the chaotic Trump first term, were very disappointed with Biden's economic policy. They were worried about high consumer prices, food, gasoline, other consumables, and they feared that more inflation was coming. So they remembered that the economy was in pretty good shape here right before COVID, and they gave Trump credit for it and voted for him to come back in. The tariff policy, I think, is going to have a terribly negative impact on the U.S. economy and economies around the world, unfortunately, with this trade war we're about to enter into. And we can see the danger signals already. As you say, the first quarter, the gross domestic product shrank by 0.3%. That's not a huge amount, but it reflected a lot of economic activity by people anticipating the tariffs coming into play. And when the reality begins to come out in this second quarter and then into the third quarter, then I think if I'm correct, then the negative effects will be much more substantial, which then takes us into 2026 when the midterm congressional elections occur in November. Every member of the House is up for re-election. 1/3 of the members of the Senate, plus a lot of state and local elections, could be very damaging to Republicans when voters take their frustration with Trump's economic failures out on these other candidates, since Trump can't run again.
And just a final on the economy, Ambassador Bolton. If a recession does happen, some economists believe that a recession will be looming towards the latter half of this year if these tariffs continue to make a negative impact, not only in the US, but globally. So if a recession hits the US, do you think Donald Trump will be on his way out?
Well, I think he's on his way out anyway. I think the 22nd Amendment bars him from running for a third term. He can talk about it all he wants, although in an interview that was broadcast on Sunday on NBC with Kristen Welker, he came very close, as close as he's come to saying he's not running for a third term. He actually mentioned Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio as possible nominees to carry on his policies. And, you know, it's very, very dangerous for a politician to name the people in line behind you, because a lot of people then say, great, bring on the new people as soon as possible. So this was, I thought, a very revealing interview by Trump, and indicating that he understands basically he's not going to run for a third term.
Absolutely, and I'm sure he's, through gritted teeth, Ambassador Bolton, that he's pledging his allegiance to J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio. They're going to have to drag him out of the White House. But I want to get more into the international space now and read out a post from Donald Trump's Truth Social page last week. Late last week, he wrote, "Many of our allies and friends are celebrating May 8th as Victory Day, but we did more than any other country by far in producing a victorious result in World War II. I'm hereby renaming May 8th as Victory Day for World War II and November 11th as Victory Day for World War I. We won both wars. Nobody was close to us in terms of strength, bravery, or military brilliance, but we never celebrate anything. That's because we don't have leaders anymore." Now, of course, the United States deserves as much praise as they should for their involvement in World War I and World War II, but and we didn't see Donald Trump signing an executive order, nor did he announce another public holiday. But when we're in such a awkward time in terms of with our allies and allegiance to our allies, do you think this helped Donald Trump's case? He seems to be pushing major allies away yet again.
You know, it's hard to peer through the fog in Trump's brain to see what he had in mind here, but you know, he apparently forgot that we celebrate Veterans Day in November on behalf of all of our veterans from all the wars we fought, and we celebrate Memorial Day at the end of May every year for those who have fallen to protect our freedom and our way of life here. So there's no lack of celebration for the American heroes who have defended our country. And just because Donald Trump doesn't remember, it doesn't mean that other Americans don't remember that May 8th has been VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, ever since 1945, when that happened. And you know, the Russians have a big celebration on VE Day. They'll have it this Thursday. That's one reason Putin asked for a 3-day ceasefire with Ukraine. He didn't want his parade disrupted by the Ukrainians. So you know, if Trump understood any of that, you know, maybe he would have a different view. But I think he's gotten into this focus on showing how tough he is. We're now going to have a parade later this summer to celebrate the birth date of the U.S. Army, which happens to coincide with Donald Trump's birthday, and it'll be the first military parade in Washington since George H.W. Bush's administration, when we celebrated the ousting of Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, a real military victory. And it's just an indication of how divorced Trump is in many respects from the functions of a real president who has big issues to decide. Trump's deciding small issues. He's become the chairman of the Kennedy Center Board of Directors. Maybe he's worried about the carpets and the drapes in the Kennedy Center. These are the sorts of things that distract him and show that he's not following a philosophy here. He's following whatever comes across his scope of attention that interests him.
But Ambassador Bolton, when we have Donald Trump, he's alienating himself from the rest of the country. He's following his America First agenda to such an extreme. And then, of course, you said he's got this military parade at the end of the year. Is it giving you the sense that he's really following along with the way that President Xi or the way that President Putin really dictate their countries? They have these big events where they celebrate their military. They have these big events where they celebrate their leaders.
Well, in part, I think that's right. I think I can tell you exactly where Trump got the idea for the military parade. President Macron of France invited him to Bastille Day on July the 14th, 2017. And the setup is, as many of your listeners will know, is that all these military units parade down the Champs-Élysées, down toward the Place de la Concorde in Paris, where they set up a big reviewing stand with Emmanuel Macron right in front of the cameras for 2 hours or however long the parade is. And I could just imagine Trump saying to himself, I want that kind of parade.
Absolutely. We wouldn't be able to do this interview, Ambassador Bolton, without touching on the big news last week. Mike Waltz obviously leaving his job as National Security Advisor and moving into, well, not moving in, he's been nominated for US Ambassador to the UN, 2 roles of which you've held. Now, when you read this story and you heard the Trump administration label this as a promotion from Mike Waltz after the Signalgate drama, are you believing that?
No, it's not a promotion at all. In fact, I think this whole episode demonstrates the continuing chaos within the Trump administration. First, it was pretty clear from the long delay in the White House reaction when the story broke on Thursday morning. I think it was 4 or 5 hours since this waterfall of news that Mike Waltz was about to be fired came out. And I think the reason for the delay in a White House response was they were taken by surprise. They didn't know what to say. So they came up with 2 ways to try and distract attention. Number one, that Waltz would be nominated to be UN ambassador, as if to say this is all perfectly normal, nothing to see here, just, we always nominate national security advisors to serve for 101 days before we move them on to something else. It's true it's longer than his first national security in his first term, Mike Flynn, who lasted 22 days. But really, this is not the way to do things. And I can say that because I remain, to this day, Trump's longest serving national security advisor with 17 months. I don't know if my record will survive this term or not, but it's just not normal to move people around. And I would say, with all due respect to Mike Waltz, who I give credit at least for taking responsibility for Signalgate. Everybody else ran from it. He at least admitted he was responsible. The normal line of progression, as the labor unions say, is you can be UN ambassador and then maybe rise to a higher level job. It's not the other way around. And I love being UN ambassador, but there's almost nobody in Washington in the national security space, if you gave them a chance to have one of the 2 jobs, that they'd pick UN ambassador. They'd pick national security advisor. Everybody would say that, except the Trump administration. And then to show further that this took them by surprise, that they weren't prepared, they didn't have somebody to fill the national security advisor job full time. That's one way you pretend that everything is in order. You announce somebody's leaving and you announce the replacement. They didn't have anybody. So they decided to say that Secretary of State Marco Rubio would take the job on an interim basis. And they said, well, there's precedent for that because Henry Kissinger did it back in the Nixon administration. Yes, that's true. In the depths of Watergate, in the midst of an enormous constitutional crisis, where it's possible nobody else could have been, no other Nixon nominee could have been confirmed for Secretary of State other than Henry Kissinger, that he assumed both jobs for a short period through Nixon's resignation into the early days of the Ford administration, when Ford himself realized he had to split the job, and he made Brent Scowcroft, who was Kissinger's deputy, into National Security Advisor. Saying that your precedent is the Nixon administration in the middle of a constitutional crisis months before Nixon resigns is not a good look for the Trump administration. And it just shows, as I say, how unprepared they were.
And especially right now, where the roles are such high stakes, there's so much going on in the international space. Ambassador Bolton, though, but when we look at this Mike Waltz situation through a glance, you mentioned that, you know, credit where credit is due, and he at least admitted to his mistakes. But this is the one guy in Trump's top officials that actually has government experience. He's actually got something to back him up. We look at Steve Witkoff, who's a former real estate property developer or investor. We've got Pete Hegseth, who is the defense secretary and was heavily involved in that signal chat and then broke the protocol yet again. We've got J.D. Vance, who's only had 2 years experience in the Senate. Elon Musk, who's advising Donald Trump very closely. He's been referred to as co-presidents with Donald Trump. So Mike Waltz is the only one, the one that got punished for this situation, but he's the only one with experience. So what do you think this currently says about the state of the Trump administration? And I wonder, was Mike Waltz the wrong person to go down with the ship?
Well, I mean, it was certainly a breach of judgment to set up the Signal chat group to begin with. What I've been telling people is, if you want to have a chat group of senior national security officials, it's called the Situation Room, and the National Security Council you should be going through. The story for Hegseth, I think, is that he may be the next to have to resign. There's a story in the Wall Street Journal this morning about multiple other uses of Signal that he engaged in just the first few months, not using official government channels of communication. Trump has supported Hegseth very strongly, but I think it's only a matter of time. Trump does not want to be seen. He didn't want to be seen with Waltz, and now not with Hegseth, to be coming under pressure from the media and the Democrats in having to make these changes. But I think morale at the Pentagon is in very bad shape. They see the Secretary of Defense doing things that if a common enlisted man or woman or an officer did, they'd be dismissed almost immediately for it. So it's really a crisis of confidence, and I just don't see that Hegseth can last much longer without causing real damage certainly within the uniformed ranks at the Pentagon.
Absolutely, especially when it's only been a few weeks. But just to wrap up the conversation, Ambassador Bolton, we've got Mark Carney, newly elected Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, visiting Washington, D.C. after a very tumultuous few months with Donald Trump and his administration. Mark Carney's comments on social media have basically been that Canada and the US are strongest when they work together. So do you think Trump will follow suit in this meeting? Do you think he will behave?
It's a good question. In his conversations over the phone with Carney, first after Carney became leader of the Liberal Party, then after his election, after his re-election as Prime Minister last week, apparently both serious professional conversations. There's been a joke in Washington ever since Carney announced his visit as to whether he would thank Trump for getting him elected as Prime Minister by attacking Trudeau, calling for Canada to become the 51st state, and completely eliminating a 20 to 25 point lead that the Conservative Party had against the Liberal Party before Trump started talking. You know, it's often hard to predict how Trump reacts personally to people, but again, the point that he sees things through the prism of personal relationships is very important. And I think Carney, with a background in finance, he was a Goldman Sachs banker, central banker of the UK, central banker of Canada. I think this is going to be a very professional conversation on Carney's part, and I hope they come to a relationship that allows for progress. I think Carney, frankly, has made some mistakes, though, in his campaign and post the election by saying the old U.S.-Canada relationship is over, finished. It will never be the same again. Just because Donald Trump said a lot of foolish things about Canada doesn't mean that the vast majority of the American people agree with him. And I think if people could just slow down the rhetoric a little bit, we could do a lot to get the relationship back, which I think we need to. I do think the problems between Canada and the U.S. are emblematic of the problems Trump has created with a lot of other U.S. allies because of his rhetoric, because of these destructive tariff policies. And we will have a lot of work to do to restore trust and good faith that have been built up over decades that Trump is ripping through. So the meeting today with Carney could tell us a lot about whether that's going to be possible, specifically with respect to Canada, but perhaps more broadly as well.
And we know that Mark Carney was, he became popular in the way that he stood up for Canada, and that definitely got him over the line. And people wonder, does he need to approach this meeting where journalists will be there asking questions in the Oval Office? Does he need to approach this meeting where he avoids antagonizing Donald Trump? If we compare it to the Oval Office meeting with Zelensky, does he need to take a leaf out of Keir Starmer's book and really know how to play the game in order to not antagonize Donald Trump?
Yeah, look, I think it's, as between two friendly countries, this ought to be a fairly easy meeting, and it would be, except for Donald Trump. So my guess is that Carney is just a very serious guy, and he's not going to get baited. J.D. Vance isn't going to set him off, and I think he'll look like an adult. So it could be a pretty boring time before the press, and Trump himself will conclude, let's get back to the cabinet office and the cabinet room and have the meeting and have lunch.
Oh, well, let's hope for that. Ambassador John Bolton, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Very glad to be with you.